So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's EGBA webinar titled Artificial Intelligence and Online Gambling. What are the opportunities and challenges for safer gambling? My name is Seymour Dragicevich. I'm your host and moderator today. I've been researching and working with data and AI and responsible gambling for over a decade. As the founder of BetBuddy, I headed up AI and responsible gambling at Playtech after it acquired BetBuddy, and I'm currently on the board of the Responsible Gambling Council. And today's webinar is very timely. The digital world has never been under as much scrutiny as it is today with COVID and the issue of trust in online platforms in general. And the pace of adoption of online gambling is following this wider trend of people living more digital lives. And whilst the capabilities of technology keep progressing at rapid pace, one of those technologies being artificial intelligence, some legislators around the world are growing increasingly concerned about ensuring AI is adopted for good and developed in ways that are trustworthy and safe and do not exploit people. So today's webinar will discuss both opportunities and challenges in utilizing AI to promote safer and more responsible gambling practices. And today I'm joined by Deirdre Clune, member of European Parliament and a member of the European Parliament's Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection. We have Marius Catania, head of responsible gambling and research at Kindred, a major online gaming group which owns a number of well-known brands, including Unibet. And we have Luke Sugden, a director of risk and safer gambling at Flutter Group for the UK. Flutter, one of the largest online gaming groups in the world, and that owns brands such as Paddy Power and Sky Bet. So the structure of the session will be, first, Deirdre will set the scene with developments at the EU level in respect of the digital market and developing trustworthy AI. This will be followed by a presentation from Marius on Kindred's approach to utilizing data and technology to enhance responsible gambling. And then we'll have a panel discussion for around 40 minutes, and we'll pick up a number of topics building on the earlier presentations and some of these key themes of gambling and harm prevention, regulation, and building trust in AI systems. And before we start, the webinar will be recorded. It will be available after the session, so look out for that from EGBA on email after the session. So welcome, Deirdre, and over to you.
Thank you. Okay, right, will do. Thank you, Simon. Good morning, everybody. And I won't reintroduce myself, just to say I'm a member of the European Parliament and the Internal Market Committee that will be looking at this proposal from the Commission and guiding it through the committee and ultimately through Parliament to get a Parliament position. It's all part of the legislative process. Commission proposes, the Parliament and the Council define their position, and then the three get together to produce a final result. So there's a lot of steps between now and getting the final result. The Commission published their proposals last April, just recently. I'd say in the Parliament we haven't yet got around to looking at it. Well, not yet got around. I don't mean that. It hasn't been fully allocated to the Internal Market Committee, so we expect next week to get some decision on that. There may be some parts of it go to the Civil Liberties Committee. But on behalf of my group, the European People's Party, the EPP group, I will be negotiating for the group. So this is a wonderful opportunity for me actually to hear about, from reality and those that are operating out there, how artificial intelligence is used and how it's used in your own particular industry. On the whole, I would say from a Parliament point of view, we welcome the Commission's proposal. We had our own initiative report that I authored adopted last December, just the end of last year, and many of the proposals are reflected in many of our proposals are reflected in the Commission's proposals, and that's I'm sure there was a lot of what would you say recognition that AI is important. It plays a really important role in terms of encouraging innovation. Can be seen as a good force. But it also needs to be regulated, and I don't see any voices in Parliament objecting to any form of regulation. We do need to have regulation Generally, I would think there's, as I say, an accepted broad welcome for the Commission's proposal. The risk-based approach is something that the Parliament had asked for, that there would be a risk-based approach to this, and again in an effort to encourage innovation. So we now have various categories of risks: unacceptable, high level, medium risk, and then low risk in terms of the application and use of artificial intelligence. So then the regulation side of it, and we'll have every member states will have an authority that will be designated with regulating artificial intelligence and its use, and then they in turn will key into a European Artificial Intelligence Board. So broadly, that's the approach. Really, I would say that there is a strong, certainly in my group, desire to see a regulation in place that protects consumers and their fundamental rights, but at the same time then encourages, recognises the benefits of artificial intelligence and how it can be used in so many sectors in such a positive way. And we need to get that balance in the legislation as we move forward. So I know that's sometimes that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, but I think it's very important that we would develop a balance and see it as and we certainly see that by having regulation we can develop trust in the system from a consumer point of view. Anyway, I know we had a submission from the Consumers Representative Society, and the words they want is adequate protection, risk is managed, and that fundamental rights are protected. And so that's the approach that we'll be taking in the Parliament. It's very early days. Yes, we have nothing as yet, no proposal from the rapporteur on this, but I expect we'll have that pretty soon, and we will be discussing it in our committee in the coming months. So generally, that's a broad introduction, Sam, as far as I'm concerned, and where we're standing. We're at the phase where we're listening, trying to learn, trying to understand the impact of the Commission's proposals, and as always, open to suggestions or ways to improve or things that people feel that certainly won't work as intended. So this is the phase we're at the moment. So it's opportune that we have this discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. Thank you for that. And that's a nice segue. The point about being open to ideas and learning as we move to Maris, as she will talk us through some of the work that is being undertaken at Kindred. So over to you, Maris.
Thank you. So today, what I'm going to discuss is more the markers of harm. It's very difficult to just say, I mean, safer gambling is already a very difficult topic, let alone saying, you're going to employ AI in safer gambling. It makes it even worse. So what I'll be presenting today is the markers of harm that we use. And also this would be just the step before we can go into considering AI. So if you go to the next slide, it's very important to keep in mind that there are different stages for proactive responsible gambling. So you have the detection you need to assess, as mentioned, with a risk-based approach, categorize, but then also how to mitigate. So it's not just detecting the markers of harm, but what to do once these are detected. And if you go to the next slide, we know that psychologically gambling is not something that just happens from one day to another. It's a continuum of behavior. And although most of the prevalence studies always show less than 1% that have a gambling disorder, this is a huge topic because of also the number of affected others. The recent research I read actually says that for each person who has a gambling disorder, there's at least 22 people impacted. So although the prevalence rate might be low, the impact is huge on gambling issues. So for this, if we go on to the next slide, we build a system we call PSCDS, a player safety early detection system, and this started in 2012. So in the beginning, it was more around detecting, and then there's a human assessing that risk, and we categorize and mitigate. But we saw that we need to improve this a bit more. We need to look beyond what others were doing as well. So next slide. So when we looked into the future, when we looked into PSCDS version 2, what should we do? Next. And we identified that it was quite typical, even not just for us, but for other operators, that we base everything on financial activity. Now, most operators will use threshold if a person reaches this level, but we all know that there's another topic which makes it even more complicated, which is affordability. 50 euro might be something which is such a small amount for one person, but this can be a huge amount for someone else. So if we go on to the next, we also saw the distribution. So it's not just having those 2% that are showing the gambling disorder, but we also have some people that are going on to the problem and back to social. And how can we use these markers of harm in order to reduce that transition as well? So going on to the next slide, we wanted to be more efficient as well. And this is what I mentioned with AI. AI will help you gain that efficiency. But before you go into that step, you need to really identify what you're going to look at. And I think with online gambling, the beauty of it is that there's so much data points that you can look into. And if we go on to the next slide, another issue that we saw was that in research, a lot of times self-exclusion was being used as a proxy measure for problem gambling. So in most research, we always used to identify the people who self-excluded. But when you look into the data, we realize that you either have people who are self-excluding, either with no activity, or they disclose that they don't want to gamble anymore because they don't like the website. So you have a pool that you're analyzing, knowing that it's not entirely showing harm. It could literally be just a way of closing your account. And then on the other hand, we have a number of customers that would never use self-exclusion. They would contact the operator saying, close my account entirely. They don't even want to go to the self-exclusion flow. Or they have disclosed that they have problems and they never chose to use this tool. So what can we do to really take an overall approach with this? So if you go to the next slide, we decided to take a different approach. So instead, we used the DSM-5, so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's renowned globally. It's used by different care professionals, and it lists the different criteria that one would display if they have a gambling disorder. And if you go on to the next slide, you can see that these 9 criteria would be there. But there's still a limitation here. How can I, as an operator, really see preoccupation? How can I, as an operator, see tolerance? So that was also a different thing. This is very much on behavior on client-facing roles. So we took a different approach where we consulted with regulators, treatment centers, and people with lived experience to try to map how these would translate in the online world. So for example, with escapism, it's not just gambling a lot, but also spending a lot of time on the website. For example, loss of control. People might set a limit, but then increase it or remove it. So once we translated these into more than 24 criteria, then we decided to see how are these present with the population. And if you go to the next slide, we did what we call cluster analysis. Now, the next slide is a more picture reference, which is mainly my colleagues trying to explain the very complex stuff I come up with to the other employees in the company. But mainly cluster analysis is quite good because it will group people depending on the criteria that you give. So it's not looking into just self-excluded customers. It's not looking into just people who logged in at night. It's looking into the whole population. And then with these criteria, how do they present themselves? And what we saw, if you can go to the next slide, is that we found 4 major groups. The majority of the customer base actually showed that they were all scoring negatively on these different criteria. And as well, we wanted to make this clear. We want to be transparent with this. So even how we translated the DSM criteria is all mentioned publicly as well. We saw a second group, which was only made of 0.3%, that they did display more financially vulnerable characteristics. So as you see here, for example, more around the depositing amount, the chasing. And the next slide. And then the two other groups, again, they didn't make up that much of the population, but you see the third group, there's a high intensity when it comes to begging for a bonus or abusive communication, so psychological strain. Whereas the fourth group, which did compose a bit of more customer base, but they didn't show that much intensity on the criteria. Now, if you go on the next slide, we want as much as possible to publish what we're doing. We want to ensure that other operators and different stakeholders are informed about what we're doing. And in fact, we did publish thinking behind the PSCDS system. So what I just explained in a peer-reviewed publication. So even if other operators would like to follow this system or would like to look into this criteria, they can find it publicly as well. Now, obviously, there's another transition which is not that easy. This is more theoretical, this is more academic. How can we then make it possible from our perspective? And this is again where technology can come in. So for example, I mentioned bonus begging before. But when people start begging to get a financial incentive to continue gambling, I was looking into the communication part. But we know that it's not that good because you will have to continuously look into live chats and calls. But for example, through different data points like web analytics, we can monitor how many times a customer goes on the bonus area of the website. So like that, there's also another transition to make the data points even more close to as much as possible to real time, which is again another challenge then. Next. So from our perspective, we come up through these 24 indicators, we will come up with different risk levels. So as I mentioned before, more risk-based approach. But the draft, the change, what we see here is that the system is designating the risks. So just to give an example, if you're at the highest risk, there is a block, so the system doesn't let you to deposit any more money until there's a conversation with the staff members. Level 2 is a humanistic intervention. And this is very good to highlight that even though, you go for AI, you still need some human intervention because this is a very, very sensitive topic. So I personally don't think that a message will always be enough. We see a lot of better outcome when we have a person actually talking to the customer. And level 3 is what we're working on right now to have as close to real time as possible pop-ups. So the lowest risk, we can go for something which is more technology based. And obviously, as soon as these are rolled out, then the system can start learning as well. The level 2 and level 1, we still feel that there needs to be a humanistic intervention. Next. And this is just to give an idea of the flow of what might happen. So for example, this is a real case that we had. And we see here that we have a customer born in 1989. Of course, I say he's quite young because I was born 2 years before. But this customer registered in 2007. So he had been playing with us for quite some time. And he was very regular in his playing. But he was detected in 2018. So still when the system was very financially based, that we needed to do something. And the reason for detection was change in pattern, velocity of the transaction, but also increasing after losses. And this is where academia and operators should work together. We see that, everyone knows, chasing losses is one of the biggest criteria when it comes to markers of harm. So in this case, we did send an on-site message. Now, we did notice that once the customer received this on-site message, he self-regulated. And this could be a method where a system can learn. So depending on the intervention, what is the change afterwards? Because there's usually a lot of focus on how to detect, but we tend to forget how to intervene as well. And the system needs to continue going. So then, a year after, the customer was detected again. But that's where there's a stepped care approach. So it's not just you get the same on-site message every time. And in this case, we actually send what we call a personalized one. So it's written by a person that it will identify exactly what you've done and our concerns. And we've seen quite a good uptake from consumers where they contact us back. Not only because I get the question, like, wouldn't a person be annoyed that you do this? Like, why are they watching me? We actually see the opposite. We see very positive feedback from customers. They're very happy that someone is actually asking these questions, and also they can be in charge of their account, and they can set up limits with us, and they can regulate their gambling. Obviously, depending on at which level of the gambling issues you are. As we know, if someone is experiencing gambling disorder, sometimes we need to take action because the person might not want to. And then what we see that after everything, the customer actually managed to self-regulate himself and stayed at a constant level. So just 2 more slides. So this is also just to attack the usual comment of the oxymoron of safer gambling. We see that it's actually the best way to do business. It's not just good from a social perspective, but it's also good for a company. It can provide more sustainable relationships with customers. If you want quick win, then yes, don't use safer gambling. But if you want stable relationships with your customers, you need to be proactive. Next slide. And this is just to show that, okay, that was a bit fast to read. This is just to show that we have the 3 levels that you need to keep in mind. So I imagine that AI can contribute to each one of these eventually. But what we see is that there's not only the detection part, but you also need to analyze which is the best approach to get the customer on board, and thus which is the best intervention. So not just to detect risk, but also how to mitigate it. I think that's all from my end.
Awesome. Thank you, Maris. Just a note on that. You referenced the research paper. Is that something that the audience can access? We can send a link out to afterwards, because I think that would be valuable. There was a lot of detailed work in that. So we'll try and send that out to the participants afterwards. Just before we get into the panel discussion, note that you can submit questions on the chat section of your screen. So if you do have any comments or questions, please share them. We'll try and pick those up as we get into the discussion. So let's start with you, Luke. So we've heard from Kindred there about their approach and what they're doing and some of the benefits. Can you share perhaps some of the successes or positives that you're seeing within the Flutter group in terms of, okay, Maris said that they're using data and markers of harm, maybe not quite what we term as AI, but what's happening in Flutter and what are you doing and where are you seeing some success?
Yeah, I could take you through some of that. It's a really kind of interesting area, and you know, there's quite a lot of work kind of going on and looking at this. I think definitely, and obviously topical for now, the safer gambling element is probably the primary focus. And you know, we've got sort of shy of 5-6 million customers playing with us in the UK every year. And that's, you know, a real mass market approach. You know, we tend to have casual players, which is exactly how we want it, because we think they're really sustainable customers and really healthy customers. But as Maris was sort of saying, there's a small proportion, a really important small proportion, but nonetheless small. And so in this mass market approach, trying to identify the behaviors and the things that are going on with customers is incredibly difficult. So the kind of models and the data-led approach and the kind of getting into the AI and the real sort of black box complex worlds there It's challenging, but it really helps us narrow in and close that funnel on the customers who we really should be caring about, because we can't employ a sort of a one-to-one relationship of 6 million people to look at each customer and see what they're doing. We have to we'll look at that funnel and work out how do we focus in on those customers where we really need to be intervening or talking to them or helping them or getting them to set up tools and the such like. So there's a lot on that, but it's probably also worth mentioning, because it kind of falls under a level of safety, fraud and age verification as well, because we don't typically talk about those within the sort of safer gambling world. But of course, we want to keep gambling safe from all things. So it's very much 18 plus. But we have customers who need to get through that verification process. We're really tough about not letting customers through, and we've used AI on the kind of document evidencing processes, both to make it quicker and easier, but also more accurate. You find that if you employ somebody to sit at a screen, manually sort of rotating documents and looking at them and trying to work out if the person is who they say they are, it leads to error, and that's kind of the absolute worst thing that we can get with customers who are either under 18 or who have excluded and shouldn't be coming on. So we've used AI in those processes to really make them much slicker processes, but also much more accurate. It still involves, as Maris was putting out, individuals. We often still have people looking and making sure that it's right, but the AI can do a lot of the kind of the configuration, a lot of the initial matching side of stuff. So, and then sort of similar on a fraud prevention perspective, obviously when we keep fraud out, it's an even smaller percentage of the kind of customer base and the financial transactions we get, but still an incredibly important one. And so we've been able to use sort of the data and the modeling approach on that, and we really are trying to get into thinking about AI and how we can sort of automatically block transactions going through. So we're not sort of just detecting things and trying to close loopholes after the event, but actually trying to kind of stop things on the fly, which is kind of similar to a banking model. If you go and try and use your card in a foreign country and you're maybe not using chip and pin, you often find that the bank steps in on that transaction and they're doing it in real time, and they're using some sophisticated machine learning models to do that. And we've been looking at whether we can do more from a fraud side on that sort of stuff as well. So lots of different areas that it can come into. But I will say safer gambling is the one that we see is probably the most valuable. We're really passionate about looking after our customers and getting better in that area. And so we see the opportunities, I suppose, to really push forward in that space. But there are other verticals that I would say fall under safety as well that we have had some success in.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's interesting because, you touch upon some of the challenges of using AI in safer gambling. And, we know that you gave some examples, AI works well when it's more focused and what we call environment specific. So, we know that we can generally build good detection systems when you know what you're trying to detect. If you're trying to detect a picture of a cat, there's so many pictures of cats, you can train your algorithm and it can probably do that quite accurately. Hey, darling, I'm just on a call. I'll come. Okay, we'll come and see you later. Thanks, darling. Okay, sorry about that. And I lost my train of thought there. So when it comes to harm, when it comes to the cats, when it comes to harm, Maris talked about the broad spectrum of harm, and so how do you start trying to get around that problem if the spectrum is broad, but AI works well when it's specific? How are you approaching tackling that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there's a couple of different things. You're absolutely right. The kind of models and the kind of AI-led things, they're really like binary outcomes. They're like an absolute yes or a no, and they can kind of predict really, really well the likelihood of you having a problem or going on to have a problem. But they're often trained using that really binary data, and of course, problematic gambling is not binary. What we see from lived experience when we talk to people who've been through it is absolutely everybody's story is different, and their route through is different.
think we've lost you there, Luke. Can you?
Am I back?
Oh,
Sorry
we lost you for a second, but no, please carry on.
Apologies for that. I think my internet connection. The beauties of working from home, so, we're both experiencing it. Every customer's different, and that's the real challenge. There are a couple of things that we're trying to do. One of them is we are trying to use, Maris talked about the customers who contact us, or the customers who we contact, and when we speak to them, we then find out they've got a problem, or we intervene and say, look, we want to not let you continue playing, and can we support you? And we've been trying to use that and put that back into the training data, and trying to use when the AI system and the models are finding customers to look at, almost trying to use the outcome of what we spoke to that customer. Do we think the model got it right or wrong? And then trying to kind of flag the data. And we're looking at how we can do more of that, and then almost build the set of data to help the model learn from, these are where you were getting it right, these are where you're getting it wrong. So that, like you say, it's not, it was a cat or it wasn't, but we can say, well, we were after a black cat and actually it was a black and white cat. So trying to feed that back in. So we're looking at that. And then one of the things we haven't started on, but we want to start looking on, is we've been trying to kind of think about the pathways. So we've been thinking about how we can come up with similar pathways through into gambling harm, and categorize those, and maybe start looking at AI that can understand that you are very early on that pathway. And actually think more from a prevention point of view. If we could pick you up much earlier in that pathway, could we do something? We're not there. We're definitely not there. That's kind of something that we're thinking about now and wanting to sort of start into next year. But we think maybe that's a way of sort of making it less binary at the end. It's more, look, actually, we're finding a more broader set of customers who are on this pathway. How do we then make sure we get to them earlier and maybe get them to set the tools, or get them to understand where they are better, rather than sort of it's a binary, yes you are and no you're not.
Yeah, so you're thinking of more micro segmentation and building AI for specific populations, so that you get that benefit from the AI, which is the accuracy. In terms of, it seems that there's, from what I can see from my own background, from understanding the industry, there's an increasing reliance on technology, whether it's fraud, whether it's AML, whether it's safer gambling. How accurate are these systems? Like, so, if you are deploying these, in the real world, what does good look like? If someone was to ask you, what do you expect from the system? Can either Maris, yourself or Luke, share any data on that? And we also have a question around, can you even potentially triangulate the accuracy of these systems with survey data as well? So can you see whether the detection is correct based on what somebody said on, say, a PGSI survey? So any thoughts on that, accuracies, and how you test that in the real world?
So when it comes to the system right now, if a customer is detected, what we do is that the analyst, when checking the account, they also can contribute whether the risk is good or not. But that doesn't really help with customers that wouldn't be detected. So in fact, the next step is to use the PGSI data. So it's a regulatory requirement, but it's also something that we have on the website. So customers can fill in the PGSI test, and we're just sorting out some data protection to be able to use that data then in order to counter check the system. Because obviously if you have, let's say, 5 people scoring 27 on the PGSI and they're not detecting, then the system needs to be improved. But it's constantly, it's not something that you would say you roll out a system and it's done, because you constantly need to upgrade it as much as possible.
Luke, anything to add to that?
I think I would say we're definitely not going to get into the detail of the statistics and all that sort of stuff, but there are great measures of the genies and things like that absolutely measure kind of the discretion of the models and the discretion of the AI systems that can say how well they are at finding the customers that we want to find, and how good they are at funneling down into those groups. And we use those kind of statistical techniques to make sure we understand those models. And then when we put models live, to make sure they're performing in line with how we predicted, and if we can understand deterioration, that we can, like Maris was saying, we can then retrain the models or do different things. So I think we're really good at knowing that the accuracy side of things. But you know, they're only as good as the data you put in, and so I'll keep coming back to this mass market approach, which is they're never going to find everybody. You know, there's the idea that you put in the world's most sophisticated model and therefore you always find all the customers you need is never going to happen. It's like sort of you know, improving safety for crossing the road. There's still going to be accidents that happen. You know, sort of I think Kindred's you know, sort of out there thing like getting to zero is a great thing to shoot for, but we sort of have to be cognizant that we can't, you know, we can't get it to zero, because that's suggesting that no one has a problem ever, you know, and that's unrealistic. It's like saying there's never going to be a car accident ever. We just want to make it as absolutely safe as we can, and lower it. So I think this kind of misconception that models can be perfect is a dangerous one, and you wouldn't want to rely on the models, only on the models, and pretend that they're perfect. That I think would be a mistake.
Yeah, no, but when we think about it, if the industry is saying we're going to rely on technology, we're not talking about a flip of a coin here, are we, Luke? Like, it's not a 50-50 where it's more accurate than that.
Far more accurate. I mean, far more accurate.
Okay.
It's the way the Genie measures it is a statistical way of coming up with it, but they're very, very accurate in terms of those models, in terms of being able to, you know, discretion and find sort of, I think Mouse was showing like down to the 3 or 4% of customers who you really want to look at, who are your highest risk, maybe the next 10-15% customers, and then really say everyone else really is very low risk. They're very good at doing that. It's more from there, you know, how do we take them forward? Yeah, this is a good slide, Maris. Yeah. So this is, I think this is your discretion model, isn't it, Maris? Yeah.
And it was interesting, you've both talked about humans. I mean, we know that Facebook employs tens of thousands of people to sort of go through potentially, you know, fake news on its platform. Okay, it has, you know, billions of users. It's a different scale in terms of the social media platform, but I think it highlights the reality of AI, that it plays some important roles in, I think you've both talked about filtering data, but at some point, if you're going to rely on it to protect consumers, it might need that human lens on it. I mean, so both of you are employing people to look at the results of whether it's the AI or the technical platform in the more extreme cases. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you know, let's be honest, a human can do something that, you know, that the AI can't do. You know, they can look on Google Street View where you live, you know, and or they can see something that just doesn't look right. But what we find is if you just ask a human, if you just give a human 100 cases and you ask them to do it, they do a really bad job of the funneling. But if you give them the high risk cases, they do a great job of working out within those. Actually, I'm not worried about this one, or actually, I'm really worried about this one. So the humans really add the kind of dimension onto it, but they're terrible at funneling 6 million customers down to the you know, X many thousands we want to talk to.
Okay, so just gonna thanks for that, guys. I'm gonna just sort of switch to sort of broader picture and moving on to the EU, Deidre. I mean, what are some of the gaps that this draft legislation is trying to address then in the use of AI? Can you share some thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose the first thing is there isn't any regulation or legislation in place at all for AI. So that's where we're starting from that point of view. And you know, we believe that by having regulation, you're going to encourage uptake, you're going to build consumer confidence, which is very important. That is extremely important. And if AI is being used and people feel it's been out of control, or the decision making is made by algorithms, or there's algorithms that are not transparent, don't know what's in them, but yet I'm at the brunt end of these decisions. So there is a need, because there is no regulation at all, to have something in place. But at the same time, recognizing that you know that there are risks and there are not risks. There's levels, and that's actually in Maris' approach there. You know, that's within the gambling sector, you can see where the high level to low level risk is appropriate. And again, in terms of the use of AI as well, you know, to have a risk-based approach, I think that's important in recognizing that you know, there may be even in some cases a voluntary code could be needed if there was deemed that there wasn't a risk or a low level risk. And, you know, it's a bit like, I'm sure there is a code with gambling now, made in conjunction with regulators, and maybe that's the approach for the gambling sector, I don't know, but and taking out the high risk use, looking at that. But, you know, I think to say that there is, because that is the gap, there is no regulation, to answer your question. And that is the gap. And I'm conscious that we don't want to interfere in other areas, because, for instance, you hear from the medic centre, there's a lot of medical devices, there's a lot of regulation there, so they want to be careful that we're not over-regulating, not moving into a space that's already regulated, or that's in healthcare and education, employment. You know, that if there's regulation there, it's not moving. It's not over-regulation, moving into space that's already been regulated for. So, and I think, you know, the word you mentioned, like human oversight, is going to be really important to this. People, I think, and I'm probably speaking from a consumer point of view, because that's where I'd fit in this as a representative. That human oversight is really important, and both Maris and Luke have mentioned that obviously it's going to come in, and particularly it's important when you can't, I don't know, maybe someday AI or machines or whatever will be able to replicate human thinking. I don't think so. You'll always need that level of humanness, and that's important as well for building trust, that your customers will know that, you know, there is a level where this can be appealed, or a human is making a decision, and understanding then the use of the AI to get in the process to get to that point.
And that's interesting. You talked about the risk-based approach, Deirdre, that the EU's taken, and it feels that the focus of the legislation is to protect people, you know, but there's this balance you talk about. You know, you don't want to stifle innovation, and we know that all of the big tech out there, the big successful tech companies, are huge amounts of investment in collecting data and building systems around AI. But this term, unacceptable risk, I mean, I'm sort of interested to sort of hear whether the gaming industry is aware of the sort of the risk-based approach that the EU are taking. And it's kind of interesting, the unacceptable risk talks a little bit about manipulating people, you know, manipulating vulnerable people, and just sort of, we've talked about safety and safer gambling in AI, but we also know the industry uses technology and AI to sort of personalize the experience, and every e-commerce company in the world does that. All the successful ones do. So is there a risk? I mean, how do the gaming companies feel about having to limit their use of AI in terms of how they target people, and how they grow revenue per customer, how they acquire people? Any thoughts on that from Luke or Maris? Are you concerned or not?
I think from our point of view, obviously it looks like it often comes down to like, what's the shape of that regulation and that guidance, and what does that look like? I think what I would say is we often get accused of targeting customers in quite a negative way, and I suspect in the past, maybe other companies or historically maybe that has happened, but certainly, you know, we try and avoid doing that at all costs. You know, if there was then a standard set of rules that we could say, well, look, we're absolutely within, you know, a set of guidelines for this, you know, in a way that might help that perception of sort of us unfairly targeting people, and you know, it's a level playing field then. So I think that's an area that Flutter would be really supportive of, right? Of kind of a level playing field, standards and regulation across the industry that mean we're raising the bar, but we're raising the bar for everybody. So, because in many respects, when we think about these things, I think it may not be perfect for us, or it may not be quite as right as we think it needs to be. But if it's standard across the industry and it's raising the bar, that's overall, that's good. So I think it obviously depends exactly what you know, how far it goes, what it looks like. But there's positives to it. It's not just, you know, it's not all about tying people's hands, right? You know, and if there are operators out there who are doing things that shouldn't be, and we can address that through it, then there's good to come out of it as well. So
yeah. Yeah, that's that is one of the objectives of the, you know, obviously of the regulation. You would have standards, level playing field, and to give certainty too for developers. Certainty, there's a market there, and it's the same across Europe. And this applies too it's for public and private bodies, as well as those that are selling products and services into the European Union. So it's So that's the idea, and you know that's a very important point. You say that we'd have the same standard, the level playing field, the level playing pitch, and that's important certainly for all industry operators. I'm sure to know that if there's rogue operators that they won't be allowed to operate, which I'm sure is happening. But just, you know, one of the unacceptable risks is, as you meant, was social scoring, that type of thing, exploitation of children. But then we've discussed under 18s, and so there would be a lot of consumer concern around that, and particularly when we're talking about online gambling, which is something that's really it has grown in the last number of years, hasn't it? Particularly in the last 12-18 months, I'm sure. So there would be concerns, and I mean, I was happy to hear Maris there saying that when you're developing your responses, you speak with regulators as well as those treating or those addiction services and those treating individuals that have gambling addiction. So that's very important. That kind of psychological thinking would feed into your approach to dealing with your customers.
I think that is something that I really cherish overall. Being able to speak to people who've gone through gambling disorder, being able to speak to people in treatment centers, regulators. The worst is when you have certain regulations based what they might seem on a whim. So they might be like either blanket limits or certain approaches that, although they might have been done with good intention, they would not really correspond to safer gambling. Like, for example, at one point in Sweden, there was a blanket limit, which from my end, I thought it was too high as a limit. So you need to also consider both aspects.
But just on this, we talked about, we know that there are some rules and policies and best practices in place. You know, for example, if you're targeted, you shouldn't be targeted. If you're high risk, you shouldn't be targeted. Do you see a future where standard practices, like in not just the gaming industry, but in any e-commerce industry, like cross-sell? I was at a conference yesterday where somebody gave an analogy. You know, if I go into a pub and buy a pint and have a drink, I shouldn't be cross-sold a tequila just because somebody like me has previously bought a pint and a tequila. Do you see these types of restrictions potentially coming into the gaming industry, where the automation of cross-sell and will be restricted due to regulation? Any thoughts on that?
If I order a drink, can I get tequila? Well, I mean, is this would you class as kind of targeting you, targeting advertising and that? Yeah.
It's a
promotion.
I guess in the gaming industry there's a broader discussion around advertising and things. So, but the targeting of advertising and offers feels to me it could be something that could fall within this sort of risk-based approach in future. And I just wanted to get the panel's thoughts on that. That was all.
Well, my thought on targeted advertising, it's a discussion that we're having or promoting. You know, there's a role for it in terms of, if we're talking about e-commerce from an industry, from a business point of view, it's important. And then from consumers, maybe they do want to know, they don't want to be bombarded. They want the approaches made to them that are relevant to their interests. So there is a role for it, even though there is a concern around it. I would say from you hear a lot of concern around it to try and control it. But from my point of view, I think it's relevant, and it should be there, because it's good for consumers, and it's good for business as well, that they're not blanketing advertising or promotions to people that are to areas that they're not relevant or that there's no effect.
Okay.
But I'd be interested in all those approaches.
Yeah, I don't know whether Luke or Maris, you had any thoughts on that. We still have a few other questions to get through, but we'll continue. Just on this, I mean, one of the other, I guess, themes around digital platforms in general is trust. Can industry be trusted to protect the consumer? And to what extent, do you think that the industry should be left to solve these problems, use AI, protect the consumer, and what role does, we've talked about regulation, but what role does sort of external validation or accreditation play here? Do Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, you know, should we trust Flutter and Kindred to solve this problem on their own, or the industry on their own, or is there a different approach?
I think when we're talking about this industry, you have such a different myriad of operators. So you might have operators that are just, you know, very lack face validity and they're not really doing stuff. You can have other operators that are. You have different regulated and non-regulated markets in place. I mean, like we've seen in the UK, you have certain operators pushing for non-GamStop casino. So I can never see the whole industry as trustworthy because you have so many players. But I think something that is lacking is the collaboration part. So you can have responsible gambling and safer gambling did change from this necessary evil to a unique selling point. I mean, Simo, you remember before you wouldn't even have a panel on safer gambling, and now it's always like the hot topic, and it's not a session at 5 p.m., but it's actually at 11. So I think there needs to be more discussions and more collaborations. As I mentioned, treatment centers, lived experience, but also with regulators. It's very important to identify and use data, because this is something we ignore. We have all the data. So the more research that we can do, the better, in my opinion.
I wouldn't mind jumping in on that as well. I think, you know, obviously, especially in the UK, we are heavily regulated, and you know, there's a whole set of rules and regulations and things we have to follow with the UK Gambling Commission, but also advertising standards, and you know, we're a very heavily regulated market, and within that, you know, I think we can be trusted to you know, to operate within the regulations, and you know, clearly if we don't, you know, there's consequences for that. But there are other things that I think we don't talk about. So, you know, there's things like GamCare in the UK, there's the National Gambling Helpline, but GamCare run an accreditation process. You know, so for Flutter and for other businesses, GamCare will come in and they will sort of audit you, and then you know, you can get different levels of accreditation from them, and then you can work to get the highest level of accreditation from them, which is what we're working to do. So there are things like that as well, where it's, you know, it's not that, you know, operators, I think it's not sort of just like throw it over the fence and say, oh, you're trusted. You know, there's things that operators are doing that are genuinely good, but also we're working with companies like GamCare who are independent, who, you know, who then come in and telling us where we could be better, and then helping us improve as well. So
but Lou, can GamCare really advise you on sort of how you use AI, for example? Because it's a highly technical area, and I guess the question I'm looking at what's happened with Facebook. And you know, there is no trust in you know, social media platforms, and can they protect you? Can they protect people from online harms? You know, we have the online harms bill that's coming in the UK specifically for that. How can, you know, you as a sort of an industry convey the trust that, look, you know, we are using advanced technology. It is complex. It's not perfect, but trust us to leverage it and use it to try and protect the customer. I'm just asking, is there a gap there, or should we be trusted, or should we just trust you to do it?
It's a great question. It's a hard one to answer, because I think that I feel like we are trustworthy, but I don't feel like our customers necessarily always trust us. And you know, we see customers complain about the way we use their data when in things like fraud prevention, for example, and some of those systems do some tracking of computers and things like that. And you know, we get regularly accused of misusing that data, and we don't misuse it. We are trustworthy with it, but actually consumer confidence you know, isn't always there around those things. So I mean, I would say yes, we can be trusted, because you know, I know we're not misusing that data, but I do think there is a challenge there, and I don't think that consumers are worried about the use of their data, and they're worried about the proliferation of the use of their data, more than I think sometimes we think. You know, we often just think we'll solve it with data, we'll sort of throw it all into one big database and share it, and that will be great. You know, but there's consumers at the end of it who are saying, I'm not sure I want that. You know, and me as a consumer, you know, if I go and buy a pint of tequila or whatever, you know, I don't particularly want them passing my details on to the next pub and having a data off me. You know, I get that might help, and that might be the best thing to do, but I'm also pretty nervous about that as an individual. So no, I think it's a good question, and yeah.
Yeah, but I think this lack of trustworthiness does also come from legacy. I mean, in all fairness, a lot of data was used to have VIP programs to get more people on board. We see a lot of the lived experience where they were pushed more and more with bonuses. So I think this is why there's a lack of trust in this industry. And even sometimes to now, if you compare how many people are involved from an organization point of view on high net worth customers or priority customers compared to people in safer gambling, it's quite a discrepancy. I have a lot of colleagues that are on their own taking care of safer gambling in other markets, in other companies. So they would have these huge teams to get customers on board and continue playing, but then you have one person who's trying to fight all of it. So I would say I'm a bit on the side with some people on the trustworthiness.
I would jump on that slightly. I'm sure there are companies like that. I would just say we have far more people looking at customers' accounts than we do trying to onboard VIPs. Far more. We've got sort of 200 odd dedicated staff who just speaking to customers day in, day out in Flutter, just in the UK and Ireland, let alone internationally. And
but that might be Flutter,
I'm not saying the same. No, I know I can only speak for our organisation, but just also to put the other perspective on there is, we have a lot more customers. We have a lot more people thinking about looking after customers from the safety point of view than the sort of converting high net worth individuals and that sort of stuff. So we're just from our point of view, we're massively overweight the other way, and I think that's healthy from our perspective. But yeah, Maris, I'm sure different companies, different jurisdictions, different things that will happen.
I mean, it's an interesting point. I mean, it's usually the big companies that are benefiting from AI. They have the budgets, they have the data, they have bigger player bases, they can have dedicated teams. I mean, what can the likes of Flutter Group and Kindred do to raise standards with some of the medium or smaller size operators? It's been said you're only as strong as your weakest link. So, any thoughts there on we've heard the C word collaboration in this session. Is there anything else the industry could do to spread that expertise and knowledge and capability?
I think, publishing research does help. But then again, maybe either from a regulator perspective, I don't think I can go in a company and just shout at people, although I would like to. But I do know, for example, some SG managers that are not allowed to look at certain data points, or they're not allowed to do certain, send certain on-site messages. I don't know how it can get out. But these are stuff, it's a reality that some safer gambling managers were fired because they did the right thing. So I don't think it's something that other operators can do to each other, but maybe it's more monitoring and maybe more liability on the higher management.
Well, I was thinking more around maybe is there something around sharing of assets and knowledge that can be done more freely that can benefit the rest of the industry. If you've invested a lot of which obviously the big groups do, you have the capabilities, the smaller ones don't. Is there something that the industry could do that can help us on this journey towards higher standards?
There is transparency, but then you need the others to listen as well. Because we all know that there is research out there showing this, but how much is it read really? So, or how much power is given?
Yeah, and I think there is more we could do. There's definitely more we could share. I don't think we've been as good at that as we could be. I think what Kindred have done, like publishing their models, is fantastic. There's a point there on some of the smaller operators is they almost don't necessarily have, all of them have the capacity, not just to build the models, but almost to take all of what we could share with them. But I think it's a good point. I think there's always more collaboration we could do, and I don't think we're brilliant at it. Kindred's probably the outlier for publishing all this sort of stuff, rather than it being a norm. So yeah, I think there is more we could do, and I think there's more we could do on sharing research as well. So I think that there's various partnerships out there with other companies like Contain and GameSys who've been doing research, who then publish that research. And actually, we find that's really valuable, for us to take research other people have done and then understand it better and consume that, and that really helps push our thinking on. So I think, any sort of an ecosystem where there's more sharing and collaboration of those things will help operators to continue to raise the standards, because it's just there's something on tap to go and get.
And we are approaching time, and we have had some specific questions, and we'll try and pinpoint those to the people afterwards. Some of them weren't quite AI related, so I just wanted to keep the discussion going. Deirdre, well, any thoughts as we wrap up? You've been listening to how the gaming industry is tackling this, and you're looking at this strategically from an EU level. Any concluding thoughts you have on this session and takeaways?
Yeah, well, it's been an interesting insight into the gaming industry itself from my point of view. But I mean, again, just the regulation. I mean, it's positive to hear that it's welcome, and from Luke Maris that it is welcome, and obviously, data. The data is really important, and that's going to be the quality of the data, the amount of data you're using is important. That's very much part of it. Really, no, I mean, I think, again, my thoughts are the same. We've been approaching this the next number of months is, protecting fundamental rights, which I think we've addressed, user safety and trust in the developments, and to encourage uptake. I think that's the broad approach we'll be taking, and they'll be the overriding parameters. And I think in the end of the day, we hope we'll have shaped something that, for the regulators will understand. We'll have a European approach, and it'll be all hunky-dory and everything will be easy. I don't anticipate that, but I do think it's important that we do have a unified approach across Europe, because like Luke says, of course, he can stand over absolutely what he's doing, and I'm sure Maris refers to that there are rogue operators. So that's what we want to do, to bring everybody together, put something in place that's not over-regulating. Nobody wants to wade into something that's already quite a number of checks and balances in place, but to make sure when AI is used, that consumers understand it's being used, why it's being used, and that their safety is protected.
Again, and any final?
That's it, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Deirdre. Anything you wanted to leave us with, Maris, in terms of sort of key thoughts for the industry to think about going forward as we wrap up this session?
Being someone who's in love with research, I would just say publish more research and share more data.
And thank you. And Luke, final thoughts from you?
No, I think it's been a really interesting conversation. So thanks for having me on. I've been a big fan of actually Kindred and Maris's work for a while, so it's really good to be able to hear more from you on that. Yeah, I agree more. I think the opportunities to share more research would be really, really fantastic. So yeah, I think we should try and do that.
Okay, and so we're up. Thank you everyone for listening and joining. Like I said, we'll follow up with we'll try to follow up with some specific answers where we can. That research link, and look out for the recording from EGBA as well. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the week. Good weekend to everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.